Hi, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our show, The Docket. As many of you know, and for those of you who don't, The Docket deals with legal issues and entities that affect you and our community. We try to present these things both in an understandable and enjoyable way. Thanks for joining us, and certainly we welcome any feedback and suggestions you might have. We'll be right back with our guest for today, and I know you'll be happy that you stuck around. Our guest today is Mario Ortiz Ceraldi, and as you can probably see, we have the same barber. Mario is going to talk with me today about immigration, and it's a topic that I really know very little about. It's a very broad topic, so obviously we're not going to be able to cover it all, but we're going to try and hit some highlights, and maybe, since I don't know a lot about it, maybe we'll be covering the stuff, hopefully we'll be covering the stuff that you're interested in too. So Mario, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, are you from El Paso?
I am, born and raised from El Paso.
Yeah, and where'd you go to high school?
I went to Coronado High School. Here.
And for college?
I went to UTEP.
And then law school?
I studied in Washington, D.C. at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law.
And did you always intend to come back to El Paso?
I did. I have family roots here, obviously. It's my hometown, and it's a unique city in so many ways compared to most cities in the United States, and I always wanted to come back.
And you don't always practice, only, not always, you don't only practice immigration, is that right?
That's correct. I do other areas such as family law and criminal law in addition to the immigration law.
And as a matter of disclosure to the people who watch this program, I want everybody to know that Mario is married to my partner, Magda, who has often been on this show. So having gotten that out of the way, let's start talking about immigration. Immigration affects this community very strongly. Is that right?
It does.
And in your opinion, again, these are very broad. You can answer very broadly, certainly. What is one of the underlying problems that we have with immigration today?
Well, especially in immigration has, unfortunately, a multitude of issues that it's addressing right now, or they're trying to address. And for the community in El Paso in particular, we have the issue with the refugees and the asylum cases and the removal cases that are pending before the courts here in El Paso.
Okay, so let's stop there for a minute.
Sure.
Explain those terms, the asylum and the removal. What do they mean?
Well, asylum is when an individual leaves their home country and they fear persecution from their home country, from their government, whether it be based on religion, race, social particular group, or political group. And they fear persecution from their government or home government, or the home government is not protecting them from other groups that may be persecuting them. And they decide to desire some kind of protection and freedom from those persecutions. And they come to the United States seeking asylum from those. An example that we generally know, I think most commonly in the United States, is the Cuban asylum cases that were back since Castro became the president of Cuba back in the late 50s. Those are individuals that were politically persecuted, who were against the government in Cuba, and they sought asylum. So those are the type of individuals that are seeking asylum. And right now we have a very large amount of individuals seeking that remedy that are coming from Central America. And because of El Paso's proximity to the border, which we are a border town and we're bordering Mexico, a very large number of those individuals are trying to claim asylum here in the border area in El Paso.
So to claim asylum, do you just go to the border? I'll use the term bridge here. Mm-hmm. You just go to the bridge and say, I want asylum, and based on our law, they have to be allowed to come in to the country. Is that correct?
Basically, yes. If they were supposed to come to a port of entry and a bridge, seek asylum, request it at the bridge, they would be initially detained They then get vetted. They get screened for whether they're a threat to the community. They determine who they are. And there's also a interview that determines what's called credible fear. Is their concern back home credible? Their fear of persecution, is it credible? To determine allow them to go through the process of the asylum procedure.
And then they're allowed to come in the country. Is that right?
Correct. They're under
physically
under the law, under the act. They're allowed to be coming in and get a bond of either a cash surety bond or an OPR bond, which is like a personal recognizance bond, and they're allowed to be inside the United States pending the outcome of their asylum claim.
And how efficient is that?
Well, right now, in the last number of years, it's been very inefficient because we don't have the infrastructure to handle the amount of claims that are coming in. Just to give you an example, this year, in 2023, we're now in the beginning of April, and as of March, there was at least over 300,000 individuals who've already tried to claim some kind of relief at a port of entry in El Paso, in this particular sector. It may not be all asylum cases, but or individuals who are reaching the border, trying to come into the United States either illegally or at a port of entry, seeking some kind of relief.
And then when they come in the country, where do they stay?
So first of all, we have certain procedures right now that's been in place for a few years that addresses that some stay in Mexico. So they don't come in necessarily because we don't have the infrastructure. That's the issues we have. The volume of cases are coming in. Normally they can be held at a detention facility here, a processing center, or they can be released and actually stay in the United States. The problem is that a majority of these individuals who are coming in or trying to come in are actually being held in Mexico because we just don't have the resources to accommodate them inside the United States. So there are facilities in Mexico where they get to stay to handle the initial screening of their cases. And then if they do come into the United States illegally, if they don't cross through a bridge and they try to cross through the river, then they can be detained at a processing center. But again, the processing centers are overwhelmed with the volume of cases that they have. So our problem is that we have a numbers game where the volume is way too high for people trying to cross illegally or through asylum. And our infrastructure that USCIS, which is the immigration government arm of the United States government that's handling these cases, doesn't have the infrastructure to manage the volume.
This is just an aside. I want to get clear on this. There are special immigration courts, correct?
There are immigration courts that handle what's called removal proceedings. And removal proceedings address deportations, and they address forms of relief within those proceedings, which address the asylum cases.
All right, so somebody is claiming asylum. They do their interview and they're vetted at the bridge or the port of entry.
Correct.
And they're allowed to come into the country. Their case is then, the ultimate disposition of their case is then held in an immigration court. Is that right?
That is correct. An immigration judge is the individual who decides whether they have a valid asylum claim. Now, there is another way to seek asylum through USCIS, but that's generally not what happens when you are coming to a port of entry and seeking that relief.
So why? So then, if there's this agreement of sorts, I guess, that people stay in Mexico while they're are pending their case here, is that there has to be some sort of agreement between the two countries.
Right. There's an agreement that started around 2020, around the pandemic. It kind of centered around that because we're having a health issue in the United States and everywhere else in the world because of the pandemic. Then they started regulations that address the issue of not allowing people to come into the United States because of the health and safety issues. So then we created agreements with Mexico to house them, which is continuous as of today, to house these individuals who are seeking to come into the United States so we can process them appropriately and then manage the volume. Okay,
So if somebody is seeking asylum, I mean, some of the things I've heard, I know what you've listed, but somebody says, I'm worried, my country is full of gangs, they threaten to kill us unless my kid agrees to join, that sort of thing. Why don't they, wouldn't their problem be solved if they sought asylum in Mexico or Costa Rica or Panama? Is there a reason that you can point to that they're coming to the border here?
I think it's the fact that we are the United States. We are the beacon of opportunity, and the world sees that. And so these individuals are trying to get to the United States because I think they're looking at it as that's the best hope for a better and brighter future. I think we've had that reputation for so long that still continues today. And I think individuals who are coming from these areas are looking for a better life, and therefore they see America as being the utmost opportunity for them.
And they want to get here to do better for their families and themselves. Right. So you mentioned another term. You mentioned removal. Mm-hmm. And what is that?
Anyone who is attempting to enter the United States unlawfully without inspection, or is already unlawfully in the United States, either by overstaying a visa or entering unlawfully, will be subject to removal proceedings, which is basically deportation proceedings with an immigration judge to determine whether or not the individual will be removed from the United States or denied entry into the United States.
Okay, and your position, you would be defending these people? You're like a defense lawyer in that sort of situation?
Right. If you want to treat it like a criminal proceeding,
right.
I will be the criminal defense lawyer. So I would be defending these individuals in these administrative hearings in relations to those removals.
Is there any sort of certification you need to appear in the immigration court?
You just need to be licensed in a state where you're practicing law. There's no other requirements in order to be doing so.
And like the state in a criminal proceeding, who represents the government here?
The government is represented by the trial attorneys that are under the Office of Chief Counsel, which is
of the immigration court.
Correct. It's part of the U.S. Attorney.
Oh.
So the interesting thing is that both the judge and the prosecutor are under the same governmental entity, and they're both under the supervision of the United States Attorney's Office.
Oh, I did. So
Attorney General, excuse me.
United States Attorney General.
Yes.
Okay. And how many immigration courts do we have here, or judges do we have here?
So in El Paso, we have two court locations. We have one at the El Paso Processing Center, which is a detention facility.
And where is that?
They house, the facility is near the airport. It's off of Montana
and
Maddox, and it's where the Border Patrol office is, right there near the airport. And there is a court there. So there's a detention facility there, so the individuals who are detained there are managed by that particular court. There's usually about 4 immigration judges at that site. And then there's another facility, or another court, downtown that handles the non-detained docket, which is in the federal building downtown. And there's generally about 4 judges there also.
And when you talk about, let's talk about detained and non-detained for a minute. When you talk about detained, are they actually kept in a jail-like situation?
No, that's correct. It is pretty much a jail. And
it's not because they've committed a criminal act. It's just because they're here illegally?
Right. So if you are attempting to enter the United States and they decide to detain you and then put you in removal proceedings, place you in removal proceedings, they will house you there unless you get a bond. Or if you're inside the United States, another example would be is that let's say you're an individual who's here on a student visa, an international student visa, or you're here as a lawful permanent resident, and you get arrested for a crime that makes you removable, that you could also technically be housed in that facility, also awaiting your disposition in removal proceedings.
But when you come into the port of entry, how do they determine if you're going to be subject to removal proceedings and then go to detention, or not subject to that and not be detained?
Well, the interesting thing is that there is a provision under the Act, the Immigration Nationality Act, that deals with anyone who's caught at the port of entry or attempting to cross in, and who is caught within 100 miles of the port of entry or the border, and has been here less than 14 days. They can administratively remove them without having a hearing.
And just deport them?
It's called expedited removal, correct? And this is something that's been happening forever. Back prior to 20 years ago, a lot of people who were trying to come in illegally crossing the border, they would get detained, processed, and just released right back the same day. There is another section of the law, however, that allows them to be criminally prosecuted first for an illegal entry or illegal re-entry that had been removed prior, and they get prosecuted criminally first in federal court, and then they can then be subject to the removal hearings at the immigration facility. So usually people who are detained used to be people who have been removed multiple times or who are here on a visa of some sort who commit a crime, now they're being removed. But in the last 20 years or so, or a little less than 20 years, everyone coming into the United States illegally was being criminally prosecuted, and then they're being held at one of these facilities to be removed.
And is that basically what's happening now?
Yes, to a degree. But because we have this overwhelming number of cases coming in, they're having to modify their procedures to address the volume.
And you know, again, I really know very, very little about immigration law. You hear on TV, people come in and then they get sent to the airport and move on. How does that work? And why does it happen to some people and not other people?
So, for example, right now, the citizens from Venezuela who are coming to the port of entry, they have had recently a protective status category identified to them.
Because what's going on in the country of Venezuela.
Right.
Okay.
So they would come to the port of entry, they would seek asylum, they would get vetted, and then they would be allowed to come into the United States, and then they would be allowed to travel wherever they have some kind of family member contact, somewhere where they can have some stability and they can stay at while they're going to be in proceedings.
And what if they don't have any family?
Most scenarios are individuals who don't have any connections, they don't have any type of relief if you're trying to come into the United States, or let's say they're asking for asylum but is determined to be not credible in terms of their fear, then they're not going to be able to get into the United States.
But if they come from Venezuela, that's a protected class already. Then they come in, but they have no family here. They have no contact here. What happens to those people? They're not going on to New York or Chicago or LA.
They have to find a sponsor, as they call them. So it could be a distant relative. It could be someone else who's just willing to vouch for them. So sometimes it doesn't even have to be a family member.
What are your responsibilities if you vouch for them?
Your responsibility is making sure the individual appears for court and the individual is not a threat or a public charge to the community.
That's a pretty big responsibility, especially if it's not a family member. I mean, how do you then make, they say, I'm not going to go to court. What are you going to do? That's
the difficulty with immigration law. And that is the difficulty with a lot of these asylum cases. You have individuals from certain countries in Central America that are in removal proceedings, and they sometimes don't show.
Right.
Which can be a dilemma, of course. And the bigger problem is what we have encountering is that the question as to what is a valid asylum claim from these certain countries, does their situation really fall under that category?
Right, does it merit?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's been a real big dilemma in regards to what's occurring, because there are unfortunately, a lot of individuals who are seeking to come into the United States more of an economic reason. They're destitute based on...
They need a better life.
Right. And that in itself does not fall
doesn't
under
get
an asylum.
You here.
It doesn't get you under an asylum claim, no.
And I remember, too, thinking back, there was this big issue about separating kids from parents, and then the kids would get lost in the system. And what was that all about?
Well, the problem was that what they did is that people who were coming in, when they were arriving, they were processing them, and they separated the children from the parents. What the law says is that if children come into the United States, you don't separate a parent from the child. You must keep them together. And their cases stay together. So they track them together and they stay together. So what was happening is the prior administration decided to change some of the rules in relation to that to try to discourage individuals from coming in, because I think these individuals are being educated as to our laws and recognizing that if you come in with a minor child, you have a higher likelihood of being processed and released into the United States.
Got it.
So as a way to try to deter that, the government decided to change its policy by separating them and trying to deter people from coming. The problem was, once they separated, they didn't have the proper infrastructure to address this particular behavior. So literally, kids' cases were not being connected to their parents' cases. So then parents were being processed in one area and the kids were being processed in another area. Parents were being removed.
And the kids were still here.
And the kids were still here.
Wow.
And then now the question was, how do you find a parent from
Guatemala
who had sold everything, left everything, and now who knows where that person is? And we're trying to reunite them with their children.
Wow. So, since you're involved in this, how would you attempt? I mean, this has got to be an incredibly complex situation. I mean, what do you see are some of the bullet points that really need to be addressed to try and get control of the situation?
That's real difficult to answer, to be honest with you. I think there's so many things that are going on. We have issues where we need the countries where they're coming from to step up and really provide for their own people, and to partner with the United States in regards to providing ways to avoid this mass migration to continue. Number two, I think we have to really develop the infrastructure that we need to handle this type of volume of issues. And unfortunately, I think Congress is talking about either building walls or immigration reform, but I don't know if one side really wants to address the economic infrastructure investment that's necessary to help out the immigration courts, to help out the housing and the procedures in regards to these types of cases. So it's really, there needs to be a very large-scale, broad investment in regards to political and economic capital to make this a little bit more feasible.
So obviously there's, I don't know if you want to call it a crisis, but it's a mess. Mm-hmm. But it does seem to me, and again, coming from a point of ignorance about immigration, it seems parts of it could be separated out. Like people who have been here, quote, illegally for years and years and years. Why spend a lot of time and effort? And I'm not trying to take a side. I mean, this is really just a question. Why spend a lot of time and effort on something like that when you have all of these current issues going on? I mean, you have this stuff about the dreamers, and I mean, some of these people have never been back to the countries that the immigration courts want to send them back to. I mean, why couldn't somebody just say, look, if you've been in this country from such and such a date, or anybody who has been in this country as of X date, you're here. And now we'll move on to these other issues. Why can't something like that be done?
Well, it has been done before under the Reagan administration. And
what did they do?
They did exactly that. If you were inside the United States for a requisite amount of time, you were able to get relief, and eventually you were able to get your residency. So people were able to adjust legally, even though they may have entered illegally. And that was proposed for the Dreamers, which is the people who came in as minors prior to a certain date. And it was also proposed by the Obama administration for adults who were here for more than 5 years, who either entered illegally but they have a U.S. citizen spouse or child but can't adjust here, or entered legally but they have a minor child who cannot adjust them, okay? Because there's only certain relatives that can file for you to get a family-based petition. And it's a political question at this point. I don't think the one side of the aisle does not want to do that, because their argument is, we do it today, we're going to have the same issue in 20 years or in 10 years. We're going to go back to more people entering illegally, we're going to have the same problem. So we don't want to give them this opportunity now because we're going to have to revisit it again in 10 years.
So you're saying these proposals were made, not that any laws were passed in that regard.
No.
So I again, just to me, maybe being very naive, it seems that would be an easy issue to get off the table. And then you're dealing with all of the present issues. What kind of progress has been made with because I have heard this, making it better or more palatable for the people who want to come into the States now, staying in their own countries. Have we really done anything in that regard?
I know that we have attempted to address the issue for the domestic issues that they have back in their home countries. And some countries have done a little bit of a better job of addressing it. I know that the one thing that the United States was able to start getting is other countries such as Mexico and other Central American countries to say that they will offer them asylum or residency in their country so they don't have to get all the way to the United States.
Right.
In terms of the numbers.
So we're running out of time now, and I'm sorry these tapings go so quickly. As a matter of practicality, I wanted to get to this. So you're representing somebody on a removal issue.
Correct.
What are your defenses?
Well, defenses could be that some people have the opportunity to adjust for residency. They just didn't realize it at the time they got detained.
And the government doesn't tell them?
No.
Okay.
It's never the government's burden or obligation to tell them what the relief is available. It's an administrative hearing, so it's incumbent on the respondent, the person in removal proceedings, to address and provide and give notice to the court what relief may be available for them. So adjustment of status, they may be somebody who is eligible for asylum, but cancellation and removal is another type of relief, which means if you've been in the United States for more than 10 years, do not commit a crime of moral turpitude, and have U.S. citizen relatives that qualify you for that relief, you may be able to stay. But that's very limited in scope in terms of who's available for that. But those are types of reliefs that you'd be looking for if your client's in removal proceedings.
And how successful are you with that sort of stuff?
Well, if we find the relief and if it's possible, then we're generally pretty successful. I'm pretty successful in dealing with that. And a lot of the courts are pretty amenable to the idea. The judges are pretty good about really evaluating it and giving them every opportunity to get that relief if they get that far.
Well, we are out of time now, and I'm sorry about that. Maybe we'll just continue this at another taping. Thank you so much for coming in and at least clearing some issues up for me, hopefully clearing some issues up for the people who are watching it. It's terribly complex. Keep it up.
Thank you for having me here.